This course is for professionals working in any sort of cross-cultural environment. You may be someone working in a multicultural team, you might be doing business abroad, you could be someone selling your products to foreign customers, or you may be providing services to people from different cultural backgrounds. If you work with people from different cultures, then this course is for you. The aim of the training is to draw your attention to the role of culture in our interactions, whether at work or otherwise. It will help you understand how culture influences behaviours, how it shapes the way we interpret others' behaviours, and how you can use cultural insights as a means of creating positive outcomes. Cultural awareness is really as simple as it sounds. It doesn't require you to have any particular gift, skill, or qualification. What it requires is an awareness and a willingness to try and understand not only others, but also yourself. This course will help you develop that awareness and move towards applying it in cross-cultural situations. In this chapter, we're going to be exploring not only what culture is, but also why it's important and your individual role in any cultural interaction. As well as this, we'll also be looking at national cultures and what happens when cultural difference comes to the fore. Culture comes in all shapes and sizes. Music, architecture, food, and celebrations are all examples of culture. However, these are only one aspect. It also covers things such as beliefs, values, and attitudes. It's useful to think of culture as having both visible and invisible parts to it. The visible are things we can see, touch, and feel, such as language, traditional dances, or how we dress. The invisible covers those hidden elements of culture, such as our beliefs in what is right and what is wrong. Most of the time, it's the invisible parts of culture that shape and influence the visible. When we talk about a culture, we simply mean the shared values, beliefs, and behaviours which unite a particular group of people. This group will usually share the same invisible values and ideals, as well as the more outward signs such as certain behaviours or customs. Values and behaviours come together to give us the culture. Lots of us can be too quick to limit the concept of culture to ethnic groups or countries. Clearly, this element of cultural awareness is important and something that we'll be focusing on in this training. But it's very important to appreciate that culture is much bigger and more complex than that. Culture can refer to and capture the shared values, beliefs, and behaviours of any group. This might be a region in a country, a company, a sports team, followers of a particular type of music, and different generations within the same country. Let's think about some examples from our own lives to illustrate this point. Firstly, I want you to think about how you may speak to someone in your family if you were angry. Be honest with yourself. Now, think about how you may speak to someone at work if you were angry. Would you behave the same? Most of us would probably be a lot more controlled at work if we were angry as opposed to at home. Now, why is that? Well, the rules for how you behave at work and at home are very different because the cultures of the two places prioritise different values and expect different behaviours. Okay, now I want you to again take a second and think about how you dress and the clothes you wear. Why do you buy the clothes you buy? Why do you dress the way you dress? Do you dress differently depending on where you are and who you're with? The reason is culture. You're influenced by culture, whether that be from fashion magazines, TV, your gender, your friends, your country, or your parents. All of them, to some extent or another, have a cultural influence on you and how you dress. In both these examples I had you thinking about, did you notice how you were moving between cultures all the time? When at work and when in the home, you naturally shifted cultures. In the clothing you wear, we see you have several layers of cultural influence. This is an important learning point to highlight at this stage. Culture is something that's fluid. It's not stagnant, it's not inflexible, and it's not something that can necessarily be defined. Culture is something that's multidimensional, has several interconnected layers, and is always evolving. We all instinctively have the ability to move from culture to culture. So when thinking about people from other parts of the world, we need to recognise this will also be the case for them. Nobody really comes from one culture. We all represent lots of cultures. So, in conclusion, we now know that culture is about a set of shared beliefs, values, and behaviours. We've understood that culture is much more than what country you come from, and it's also not just about music, food, and body language. We're also now starting to appreciate where our own cultural influences might come from. Well, you're making great progress. Now that we've established what we mean by culture, let's look at what we mean when we talk about national cultures. Most people in the world identify themselves with a national culture. Obviously, there are people who don't quite fit into this neat box. However, it's fair to assume that this is the case with most of us. Now, it's important to remember that you always need to balance how much priority you give to any one person's national culture over their regional, generational, or any other culture. As we learned in the previous topic, culture is fluid and complex. With this always in the back of our minds, let's look at an example of what we mean by national cultures. I'm going to tell you a true story about a young French student called Victor who travelled to Thailand. He was staying in an area known for pickpocketing, and he was really concerned about keeping his money safe. He decided to keep his money under his socks, in his shoes. He later went to his first Thai restaurant to try the food. When he went to pay, he reached into his shoe to retrieve his money. The restaurant owner became very angry and started shouting at Victor. Some Thai diners got up from their seats and gestured for him to leave. People were clearly angry with him, so he quickly grabbed his things and left without paying. Now, do you have any idea what happened here? Can you think what mistake Victor made? Well, being French, Victor comes from a country which last had a ruling family in the late 1700s. Being from a republic with no affinity to the idea of a monarchy, he didn't even think about the fact that the Thai king's face was on the money. He probably also had no idea that in Thailand, the royal family are near godly. Even worse for him, he didn't know that in Thai culture, to put something under the feet is extremely disrespectful. He therefore delivered a double insult to the restaurant owner and his fellow diners, which led to them asking him to leave. So, we can see how differences between the national cultures have combined to give Victor a very embarrassing lesson in cultural awareness. Although all the Thais in the restaurant did not share every single value, opinion, and belief, the one thing they did share in this context was the need to express anger at seeing their king publicly shamed. Victor, on the other hand, due to his national culture, was behaving in line with a completely different set of frameworks. Let's now take a look at a high-profile case of underestimating the importance of national cultures and their expectations. In 2015, a group of British, Dutch, and Canadian tourists found themselves on the wrong side of the law when they took off all their clothes as a dare at the top of a mountain in Malaysia. Unfortunately for them, they did not take the mountain's sacred status among Malaysian people into account when they were having their fun. Arrested and taken to court, the group was spared a 3-month jail sentence specifically due to their lawyer's opinion that they'd been ignorant of local laws and customs. The tourists all came from countries where stripping naked is considered harmless fun. In Malaysia, on the other hand, it's completely dishonourable, and to do so on top of a sacred mountain added further to local anger. So again, we see how differences between national cultures have come into play. So now we can start to understand what we mean when we talk about national culture. It's the predominant values and behaviours shared within a country. We know that not everyone from that country is going to be the same, but we also know that there are certain things that tie them together. Let's look at one final example of national culture. Here's a picture of some young Japanese men lining up before work in the morning. They're bowing to greet the boss of the company. Can you think what may be driving this behaviour? Well, Japanese culture places considerable value on hierarchy, status, respect, manners, and etiquette. Over time, this has translated into the behaviour we see here, which has become part of the national culture. In all the examples, we can see how a group of people can be loosely tied together through a national culture. All nations, to some extent or another, do have particular cultural characteristics that can be perceived from an outsider's point of view. So, we've now learnt what is meant by national culture and how they come about. All of us are individuals with many layers of culture, but we also fall into national cultures as well. Cultures help us understand why we do what we do, as well as explain why we believe what we believe. In the previous topics, we saw what can happen when you don't understand the rules and cultural expectations of others. In short, you can make mistakes. These mistakes can be harmless, or they can also be very serious. This is applicable not only to when you might be travelling abroad for a holiday, but also throughout your professional life. Working with people from different cultures has become more and more frequent for many of us, and as a result, more important. The reason we focus on culture is because of the very fact that many people within professional and personal life underestimate the impact cultural differences can have. Although it may be easy to learn facts and do's and don'ts about different cultures, this is not necessarily being culturally aware. If you think of culture as an iceberg, what we see of a culture is tiny in comparison to what we cannot see. It's the unseen elements of culture, such as values and beliefs, that are usually hardest for people to understand and deal with. When we interact in cross-cultural situations, a lack of awareness can lead to bad or poor decisions. Cultural awareness helps us reduce the chances of making bad decisions and increases the chance of us making more insightful, considered decisions. How about we look at some examples to explain this further? Mrs. Carter is from the UK and is recruiting new staff at her company. She's interviewing a young man, Ali, who is originally from Afghanistan. Throughout the whole interview, he barely looks her in the eyes. Mrs. Carter, although impressed with his knowledge and level of English, is astounded with his lack of respect for her and can't believe he won't look at her. She finds his behaviour unpleasant and, as a result, he's not given the job. Now, let's look at what happened here with some cultural awareness, shall we? In this case, Mrs. Carter jumped to conclusions about the interviewee's behaviour. Had she been a little more aware of the interviewee's cultural background, she would have known that in Afghanistan, looking in a woman's eyes is considered extremely rude, if not insulting. As a result, he thought he was being polite by avoiding eye contact. Mrs. Carter interpreted his behaviour according to her values. She therefore based her decision on an incorrect reading of the situation. It's also equally valid to say that Ali should have been more aware of the fact that in Mrs. Carter's culture, looking at people in the eyes is a sign of confidence and trust. So, Mrs. Carter has potentially lost out on a fantastic recruit, and Ali has potentially lost out on a fantastic job. Although no party is to blame, the outcome hasn't been positive for either, has it? How different could the result have been? Here's one more example for you. Mr. Rossi is from Italy and has been moved by his company to manage the office of their subsidiary in the Netherlands. He's horrified to find that his desk is in the middle of an open plan office, seated next to some interns and junior ranked staff. In his first week, he moves himself into his own separate office. Although he feels much better, the local employees are enraged with his behaviour, and there's instant resistance to his presence in the office. Any idea what happened here? Well, let's break it down. Mr. Rossi comes from a culture which respects hierarchy and status. A boss should have their own office. Otherwise, they're not worthy of being the boss, right? In the Netherlands, however, they don't see hierarchy in this way. They prioritise equality and everyone being the same. When he moved into his own office, he essentially signalled to his team that he thought he was better than them. Again, both parties in this example, with a little bit of cultural awareness, may have stopped to think about what was going on. These sorts of misunderstandings do not only come at individual level, they happen at all levels. The business world is full of examples where companies have ventured into foreign countries and completely failed to understand the local culture. For example, in 2006, Home Depot, a large American do-it-yourself store, expanded into China. However, it soon had to close all 7 of its outlets when it realised that in China there is a do-it-for-me culture rather than a do-it-yourself culture. The very costly after-tax loss for this poorly considered decision was in the region of $160 million US. All these examples clearly show us how culture can and does get in the way when it comes to how we see others and the decisions we make. Cultural awareness helps us to move beyond this. An important learning point for this topic that we must stress is that being culturally aware is not about compromising your own culture or sacrificing your values or identity for another's. It's simply about helping us understand how we can best adapt our approaches, thoughts, and decisions to ensure we create positive outcomes in cross-cultural interactions. It's about respecting others' cultures as well as our own. This is going to be the focus of our next chapter, self-awareness. In this chapter, we're going to be making connections between cultural awareness and self-awareness, highlighting the importance of self-reflection and realising your own role in any cross-cultural interaction. An easy way to help us understand how people of different cultures view and interpret the world is to think of a cultural lens. Our cultural lenses are formed by the cultures in which we live. Our lenses filter the world for us and help us to make decisions as to what is right or wrong, acceptable or unacceptable. We all have a slightly different type of lens filtering our world, which means that those with different coloured lenses can and will see things differently to us. Let's think about this imaginary story taking place in the deserts of Arabia. Imagine a young boy with his elderly grandfather travelling across 3 countries in order to sell dates. In the first country, both the boy and his grandfather walk with their donkey on foot. The locals look at them with complete surprise and say things such as, "Look at these foreigners and their ways. They have a donkey, yet are so stupid they walk." In the second country, the boy is riding the donkey and the grandfather is walking alongside. Again, the locals react. "Look at these foreigners and their ways. It's unbelievable that the boy would make his old grandfather walk as he relaxes on the donkey." Now in the last country, the grandfather is riding the donkey and the boy is walking. And, yes, you guessed correctly. "Amazing! Look at these foreigners and their ways. The old man is making the young boy with skinny legs walk as he relaxes." This analogy helps us understand how different people see the world in such different ways and why. In each country, Their emphasis on different values coloured their lenses and the way in which they interpreted the boy and grandfather's behaviour. Little did they know that they each had a turn to relax along the whole journey. So, the cultural lens analogy helps us understand that we all have a natural tendency to see things differently, and that we typically use these perceptions to form judgments as to what is right, wrong, acceptable or unacceptable. These lenses are heavily shaped by our cultures, whether national or otherwise. At this point, we should remind ourselves that culture is also fluid. So, although all of us wear lenses, we wear lenses that will change throughout the day, the year, and throughout our lives. The only way to find out if the filters that we use in our lenses are giving us a true picture of reality is to start by understanding ourselves, especially acknowledging our influences as well as how we come to decisions about the world around us. This is what we should be looking at in the next topic. A common misconception people have of cultural awareness is that its main focus is learning about other people and how they do and don't do things. Although this is certainly part of it, cultural awareness also relies heavily on self-awareness. Without understanding your own self and why you do the things you do, say the things you say, and believe the things you believe, you can never really appreciate another's point of view. Self-awareness opens doors in our minds that help us piece together how we're shaped by the world around us. By acknowledging this about yourself, you also acknowledge that this is just as true for anyone else. Everyone does what they do due to underlying influences. So, really, the aim of cultural awareness is to try and understand yourself as well as the other. In any sort of cross-cultural situation, there are always two or more cultures at play, which means you need to know where both or all sides are coming from. Do you remember the example of Mrs. Carter and the Afghani interviewee? Well, let's think about the simple act of eye contact to help us understand this point. I want you to imagine yourself staring into the eyes of a member of your family. Have you got that image in your head? Great, well done. How does that feel? Feel okay? You're not uncomfortable, are you? Maybe even smiling. Right. Now I want you to imagine you're looking into the eyes of a stranger, a man you've never met. What's changed? How do you feel now? Are you maintaining eye contact? Are you perhaps breaking it now and again? Okay, excellent. Now forget the man and replace the face in your mind with that of a woman. Again, you don't know her. Anything change? How we look at people or don't look at people in the eyes is a very basic and raw expression of our cultural values. Some people in the world are brought up from a very young age being told by their parents to look me in the eye and tell me the truth. Others may have been raised being told, don't you dare look me in the eyes. You can now see why later in adult life, the two cultures will have very different attitudes towards eye contact. Think about what values might drive your behaviours, opinions and preferences when it comes to eye contact. Once we start to piece together our values and motivations with behaviours and preferences, we can start to see how we may come across to different cultures and vice versa. Eye contact is just one of hundreds, if not thousands, of examples of things we all do that have their roots in what we believe to be right or wrong. How we communicate, share information, what we look for in our leaders, and what we expect in terms of behaviour from others are all influenced in much the same way. Self-awareness is also an important tool in ensuring that we don't let our own assumptions, presumptions, and preconceived ideas cloud our lenses when we're working in a cross-cultural environment. This is something we'll be exploring next. Now that we understand the value of self-awareness in developing cultural awareness, let's take a moment to cover a really key topic: stereotypes and bias. As we touched on earlier, a common trap many of us naturally fall into when we're in any cross-cultural situation is to let our own cultural lens get in the way. Much of what we see through our own lenses is based on what is known as cognitive bias. Cognitive bias refers to the process our brains go through in order to filter out non-essential information to help us make quick decisions. It essentially helps you to create rules of thumb. So, for example, before crossing a road, although your brain may be taking in thousands of pieces of information, it's created a rule of thumb which focuses purely on the information needed to help you cross the road quicker. Namely, is there an oncoming vehicle and what speed is it travelling at? Cognitive bias is not necessarily always a bad thing, as some people may believe it to be. In fact, it can be absolutely essential. If you think of our biases as giving us mental shortcuts and rules of thumb, then you'll be grateful that you're not having to process the same information about the same things all the time. On the bad side, however, bias can make us irrational. We often seek to confirm our biases rather than to question and disassemble them. For example, if you're biased in the belief that all British people are polite, then when you meet someone British who is polite, then you're likely to take this as confirmation that your bias is true. However, if you meet someone British who's rude, then the irrational nature of our biases means that you might well conclude this individual is only an exception to the rule. This demonstrates the way in which our biases can lead us to drawing wrong conclusions, having inaccurate beliefs, and making bad decisions. Cognitive bias is natural. It doesn't make us good or bad people. It's simply the way we think. It does, however, result in flaws in our lenses. Your biases essentially colour your lenses, but as we all know, it's possible to change your lenses. This comes through self-awareness, analysing our own biases, and, when it comes to working with people from different cultures, starting to address some of our stereotypes of others. When it comes to viewing people who might not be like us, biases are often based on positive or negative stereotypes. We all carry stereotypes of different cultures to some degree or another. Examples of positive ones might be all Indians are really good at maths, or all British people are really rich. Negative ones may include equally simplistic conclusions, such as all Russians are aggressive, or all Japanese are untrustworthy. We all know that stereotypes are unfair and crude. Many Indians are illiterate. The UK has very visible poverty. Russians can be perfectly lovely people, and the Japanese can be very trustworthy. Stereotypes, in some instances, can be helpful. Much of the time, however, they can cloud our lenses and colour our judgments. They reduce complex, dynamic, and diverse situations down to simple formulas that don't always help us to make the best decisions. When working in any sort of cross-cultural situation, it's important to recognise how your biases and possible stereotypes of others may be leading you down the wrong line of thought. A positive way to unpacking our stereotypes of others is to use them to inform ourselves about our own culture and our own viewpoints. No culture stands alone, meaning that it's only by comparing cultures that we come to see certain things as distinct or different. This helps us understand some of our own prejudices and expectations. Let's look at some examples of stereotypes around Americans to help us explore this point. A common stereotype people have of Americans is that they like everything to be king-sized. King-size burgers, king-size beds, and king-size buildings. However, this opinion of Americans is only really held by people from cultures where things are done on a much smaller scale. The American way only looks bigger because we come from a place where things are done on a smaller scale. Another stereotype of Americans is that when communicating, they are loud, overbearing, and can also be rude. This opinion is not, however, shared the world over. You're more likely to find this sentiment in cultures with a very quiet, indirect, subtle, and diplomatic communication style. Through their lenses, they perceive what Americans value as being open, clear, and friendly as being quite the opposite. On the flip side, Americans might perceive the quieter communication style as being closed, secretive, and unfriendly. So, in these two stereotypes of Americans, we can see that they have essentially been formed by an outsider's point of view. In other words, our own. How you interpret an American's, a Mexican's, or an Italian's behaviour is really going to come down to your own lenses. How you perceive them may be totally different to how someone from another part of the world perceives them. This is why it's important to address your own stereotypes and try to think them through and where they come from. Not only will they teach you more about others, but perhaps more importantly, about yourself. This self-awareness will take you a long way in being able to recognise what is potentially happening in any cross-cultural situation. We're now at the end of our chapter on self-awareness. If you'd like to learn more about bias and stereotypes, then make sure you have a look at the document section, which has more information on the topic. In our next chapter, we're going to be looking in more detail at the role of values, specifically how our cultures inform our values, how these translate into our beliefs and behaviours, and how these can specifically play out in a cross-cultural workplace setting. Before we move on though, let's quickly recap what we covered in this chapter. We now appreciate that all of us wear a pair of lenses that colour how we see the world. These lenses get their colour from our culture, which includes things such as our values. With this in mind, we therefore understand why it's important to also think about ourselves in any cross-cultural situation, not just the other. Self-awareness will help us understand why and how our lenses are coloured, and also help us move beyond our biases and stereotypes, which in turn will help us make smarter observations. So far in this course, we've covered what culture is, how culture works, and how we all have a tendency to see the world through our own cultural lenses. We're now going to be looking in closer detail at values, and specifically how our values can colour our lenses. To help us better understand how values influence our behaviours, we're going to be looking at how specific values translate into different approaches to work. Our values, and therefore our cultures, impact all aspects of how we work. How we interact with one another in the office, how we run meetings, how we buy and sell, what we look for in leaders, and even how we take our lunch breaks are all shaped by our cultures. With so many possible areas to look at, it's difficult to cover them all. So we're going to be exploring 3 key topics. Firstly, we'll be looking at different approaches to time, then communication, and finally, teamwork. When examining each topic, we'll explore the different values that come into play and how they translate into different behaviours in particular regions, cultures, or countries. Using scenarios based on real-life case studies, we'll also look at how cultural differences can cause confusion when people from different approaches work together. In this topic, we're going to be looking at how people approach time. We all know that different people approach time in different ways. Well, the same can be also said about cultures to a certain extent. A lot of this comes down to the influence of specific values. Firstly, take a look at the scale on the screen. Here, we have a scale illustrating 2 extremes when it comes to how people can perceive time. Of course, it's important to remember that most people will be somewhere in between the extremes, and on top of that, most of us may fluctuate depending on context. In some cultures, time is very structured. People tend to want to control time with tools such as diaries, agendas, and to-do lists. In more time-flexible cultures, however, the need to control time is seen as much less important. This doesn't mean that they don't get things done or that they don't structure their time. What it means is that other things might take priority over time. As such, they are seen to be more relaxed about it. Now, interestingly, we can make quite a few predictions about the behaviours and preferences of people who sit at the different ends of this continuum. For practical reasons, we'll call these groups structured and flexible. This doesn't mean that someone structured can't be flexible at times and vice versa. It's just easier to understand the influence of values on our approaches and preferences. Taking a very general view, structured time people tend to have a monochronic approach to their work and to their lives. They generally prefer to do things in order and to complete a task before carrying on with another. Logic, reason, and efficiency are usually highly emphasized. They're more likely to use to-do lists and set long and short-term objectives. We also find that structured time people are more likely to value punctuality, give importance to timescales, and will tend to see time as something material. In other words, it can run out. People with a flexible time approach, however, tend to have a polychronic approach to the way in which they do things. This means they don't necessarily segment their time and lives into pieces. They see things more holistically. As a result, they tend to multitask, potentially carrying out many jobs at the same time or allowing them to continuously overlap. Efficiency and its connection to time is not at the forefront of their minds, and they tend to be people who are very much in the moment. They don't see time as having any material substance. It's not finite and therefore can be bent, shaped, and will never run out. So, why do people at different ends of the structured and flexible spectrum do things so differently? What drives these behaviours? It's all about values. There are many values that influence our approach to time. However, we're going to focus on 3 of these. These are relationships, materialism, and fatalism. As we'll see, it's differences in these values that drive the different approaches to time. Let's start off by looking at relationships. The emphasis a culture places on the value of relationships can heavily influence whether they take a more structured or flexible approach to time. So, for example, why might someone from a more flexible time culture not see the need for a meeting agenda? Well, typically they'll place a far higher value on relationships than they do on time and tasks. As a result, they'll tend to run meetings according to the needs of the relationships in the room and the feelings of people present, as opposed to what items need discussing by what time. A meeting could go off in a direction that another meeting member considers more important, or more time might be needed to ensure everyone has ample opportunity to voice their needs. They're also less likely to want to jump into business discussions with someone they've only just met. Instead, they'll want to spend time getting to know a person and building trust, all of which takes time. In these examples, the relationship is more important than the business meeting objectives, and people having a say is more important than sticking to the agenda. So, while those with a flexible approach tend to be relationship-oriented, those with a structured time approach generally aren't. Time and getting things done are given far greater priority than relationships. Relationships aren't seen as necessary for business. In fact, in some cases, the lack of any personal relationships between commercial partners may even be considered better. As a result, people from these cultures may have a tendency, for example, not to engage in small talk during business meetings, and instead get straight down to business. They also place considerable emphasis on the law and contractual arrangements to frame a relationship, as opposed to personal loyalties. Now, interestingly, cultures with a flexible approach are also more likely to be driven by a further value, that of fatalism. What do we mean by fatalism? Well, fatalistic people tend to believe that everything that happens in the world and in their lives is predetermined and preordained. Everything that will happen, and there is nothing anyone can do about it. Since they can't control time, then why should they try? Such people also tend to place less value on materialism, often being open to religion and spiritual ideals which transcend the human experience. Those with a structured approach, however, tend to see time as something that they control and something that is completely within their own sphere of influence. They also place less weight on any sort of fatalism or preordainment. They feel empowered to manage time and to use it for their own benefit. In this sense, time takes on a material form and can be used to create wealth and physical comfort. As such, the non-fatalistic person is more likely to see things from the material perspective, ignoring any potential sense of the spiritual or otherworldly. So, we now see how the two preferred approaches to time both have underlying values which shape their understanding and therefore their behaviours around it. One is more structured due to greater emphasis on materialism, control over the world, and with less value on relationships. The other is more flexible due to its preference for relationships, with an emphasis on fatalism and a fundamental belief that we are not in control of everything. Now, before we look at how certain national cultures can display these preferences, let's remind ourselves that when we talk about people from a certain culture, we're only making useful generalizations to help us understand the mechanics of culture. As we discussed in previous chapters, not everyone from a certain country is going to do things exactly the same way. Let's now look at the scale again with flexible and structured approaches to time. Based on academic research, as well as experience in the field, we're able to show roughly where certain countries sit on the scale in comparison to one another. As you can see, countries such as the USA, Canada, Germany, Denmark, and the UK tend to be more structured in their approach to time. At the other end of the scale, we find countries such as Mexico, Nigeria, India, Spain, and the United Arab Emirates, where time is more flexible. Think about your own culture. Where would you place it on the scale? Language is often a subtle indicator as to where culture places certain values. With the scale in mind, think about the saying, "time is money," which is popular in countries such as the USA, Canada, and the UK. What could be a clearer expression of the value placed on materialism than this saying? Time has literally been given a monetary worth. In Spain and Latin American countries, on the other hand, materialism has less powerful an influence on their perception of time. People often use the word mañana when they want to put off doing a job. The word literally means tomorrow, meaning the task can be done at some time in the future. When it might happen may not be stated or even known. All that is important at this point is the acknowledgement it is going to get done. This points to the greater emphasis on fatalism and the belief that things will happen when they're meant to. Now, let's turn our attention to how these different approaches to time can cause challenges for us when working in cross-cultural situations. For those that sit at the structured end of the scale, they can tend to look at those at the opposing end as being slow, lazy, inept, chaotic, confusing, illogical, and even possibly untrustworthy. In some cases, they can find flexible time people impossible to work with. At the other end of the scale, structured time people can be viewed by their opposites as being narrow-minded, unfriendly, cold, materialistic, and generally someone that is no fun to be around. Without understanding where one another is coming from, it's easy to see where misunderstandings may arise. Let's see if we can now develop the idea of differences in values and how they shape our attitudes and behaviours at work. I want you to listen to the following scenario, which is based on a real-life event. Listen out for clues to help you identify how a difference in values is causing some confusion for both parties involved. Edda is from Germany. She has just recently moved into a new role as an HR team project manager for a global company. Her responsibilities are for HR projects across a number of international offices. Her immediate and most demanding task involves the rollout of the HR interface of a business integrated system. Her local team in Germany have already embraced the system and are extremely excited about the way in which the system saves them time and streamlines their processes. They are enjoying the automation and how it's reduced the need to connect with other parts of the business. Based on her experience in Germany, Edda is optimistic about the way in which it will be received in all the company's other offices. One thing she learned from the install in Germany was the need to have everyone's buy-in to make the transition process a success. As a result, she makes the decision to visit the company's office in Spain to work with the local team prior to their install. However, after a few days, she finds she's struggling to get any positive buy-in from the local team. In fact, she's getting resistance. Her Spanish colleagues don't appear particularly motivated or impressed by the time-saving benefits of the system that she keeps stressing. They ask continuous questions about its impact on communication with other parts of the business, and appear more concerned about the short-term problems the change in system will cause. After 2 weeks, she decides to return to Germany and reconsider her approach. At this point, she has not as yet installed the new system. Now, this really happened. Why do you think the Spanish team reacted so differently to their German colleagues? Did Edda go about it the right way? Can you think what values came into play in this scenario? Well, let's break it down. In Germany, where rationalization, time saving, and efficiencies are highly valued, the system was a success. The team saw the new system as liberating in that it freed their time as well as their need to spend time with other people unnecessarily. In Spain, however, the team there placed much more value on relationships over time. The message of efficiency was not received because it's simply not as highly emphasized. Instead, they perceived the new system as potentially being harmful to the relationships that existed not only between themselves but other parts of the business. Edda should have really changed her message for the Spanish team. For example, she might have emphasized that the extra time the system would give people could be used for more face-to-face time, or she could have looked at alternative means and ways for different parts of the business to stay connected once the new system was in place. Well, this brings us to the end of our look at different approaches to time. We discussed the different ways people and cultures might approach time and how values drive our attitudes and behaviours. In this topic, we're going to be looking at different approaches to communication. As we did with time in the last topic, we'll look at the different approaches to communication and then explore the influence of values. How people communicate is a large and complex topic. For the sake of brevity, we're going to be exploring differences in how people speak to one another. So, take a look at the continuum on the screen at the moment. This shows us that people can be direct or indirect in how they speak. As with time, People can be anywhere on the scale and also jump from one end of the spectrum to the other depending on context. Again, based on research and experience, it's possible to observe that in some cultures, people are generally very direct in the way in which they speak. They believe being honest and truthful is essential when delivering information. They don't mind saying things to people that may compromise feelings, especially if there's a task to complete or similar. You often find that most direct communication cultures are English speaking. English is a fairly literal language, and there's little scope for words to be misinterpreted. This is not the case, however, in indirect communication cultures. Here, many of the languages spoken, such as Mandarin, Japanese, and Korean, need context to help people understand meanings. They rely on unspoken elements of communication, such as body language. Unlike the direct approach, indirect communicators are more likely to believe that you shouldn't give voice to something that isn't nice to say. Since they prefer not to say things which could upset people or cause confrontation, then no might instead be given as a maybe or possibly, and even sometimes as a yes. This can be extremely confusing for someone who is direct and says it how it is. So in the previous topic on time, we discussed the underlying values that might be driving the different approaches we explored. For communication, we're going to be doing the same, but this time using the values of face, formality, and stability to understand why some cultures may approach it differently. The first value we'll look at is that of face. Face broadly relates to the need to protect one's name and reputation from shame or embarrassment. Individuals in face cultures will usually make efforts to protect both their own face or reputation, as well as that of others. This might be the person they're speaking to, or their family or tribe. In such cultures, people tend not to say what they think, and instead say things which will maintain everyone's feelings and face. Their real feelings are more likely to be hidden with clues given in their body language and what is not said. It's left to others to interpret the underlying message. A key feature of trying to protect the face of others is that people speak to each other calmly, avoid showing their anger or frustration in front of others, and avoid publicly challenging others. This concept is particularly prevalent in the Asian and African cultures to varying degrees. Arab cultures, for example, are highly sensitive when it comes to protecting face. In Japan, China, and Korea, where Confucianism and Buddhist philosophy have deep influences, protecting group harmony is essential. As a result, in these cultures, you generally find an indirect form of communication. Other cultures place less value on face. In countries such as the US, Germany, Australia, Finland, and the Netherlands, it doesn't play even a fraction of the role it plays in face cultures. As a result, there's less need to be cautious with language and how you speak to people, as everyone prefers a transparent communication style. People don't hide away meanings and tend to say what they're thinking. In its own way, this has become the way these cultures maintain group harmony. So, we now understand how the value placed on face can shape a culture in terms of being direct or indirect. Let's now move on and instead look at how our different perceptions of stability differ across the world and how these perceptions translate into different communication preferences. We generally find that cultures on the more direct communication end of the scale tend to place less emphasis on stability. They are generally less conservative, so not so romantic about the past, and they see change as a good thing. In fact, in certain cases, they may even support revolutionary ideas. Business decisions are generally made for the good of the company, and people's feelings are not necessarily part of the equation. As a result, their communication style reflects this. Being open, clear, and directive helps change happen. It facilitates a movement of ideas as well as behaviours. On the other hand, for those cultures that are on the more indirect communication end of the scale, they tend to be more concerned with stability, harmony, and maintaining a connection to the past. The past, in fact, is important as a way of giving meaning and purpose. Traditions are important, and people can be conservative in outlook. The idea of revolution is seen as unhealthy and to be avoided at all costs, even at the expense of truth. This is not to say that change is never embraced. It is. It just takes a lot longer, and the process can be very different. As a result, their communication style protects stability. Being indirect and hiding away information that may cause problems helps keep things as they are. Okay, so now we have pieced together the way in which the values of face and stability influence how cultures communicate. Let's explore one further value before looking at a scenario. The final value we're going to consider is formality. Formality relates to the value we place on the way in which things are done and with whom. This can range from the way in which a handshake is carried out between people, or the way in which someone greets somebody else. It can also extend to more complicated behaviours, such as a tea drinking ceremony in Japan. The emphasis placed on formality changes in degree from culture to culture and in numerous ways. For example, people from Australia, the US, Canada, New Zealand, Denmark, Norway, or Iceland tend to be much more informal in how they behave and in their expectations. Such cultures value the individual's right to express themselves as they like. Formality is seen as stifling this right, and as such is emphasised much less in how they behave and communicate. Furthermore, formality in many of these cultures is often intertwined with status and hierarchy. With many of them being more egalitarian in outlook, they see the removal of formalities as also removing signs of status. As a result, they tend to be more direct in how they communicate, as well as much less formal, of course. In cultures where formality is important, we usually find this also correlates with being much more conservative, as well as face-sensitive. Society is usually a lot more structured in terms of hierarchy, with everyone having a sense of place. Formality is seen as a way of preserving this structure, which again goes back to the idea of maintaining group harmony. It is in such cultures that we see much more nuanced behaviours around formality and how people should interact. Take, for example, the practice of bowing to one's superiors in Japan. This is an example of the way in which employees demonstrate respect for their boss and company. In these cultures, we tend to find that they're much less direct in how they deliver information and speak to one another. There is a much stricter sense of what you can say and who you can say it to. As we can see on the screen now, some examples of direct communication cultures are the USA and Germany. Indirect cultures include the Japanese, Koreans, and Indonesians. There are a number of cultures that don't fit into either extreme. This is an important learning point. Most countries and most people sit somewhere between the extremes, not at the extremes. Take, for example, the UK. British people can be direct, but they often frame things in such a way as to make the message less confrontational, meaning they pepper their directness with indirectness. For example, a boss in the UK would rarely tell an employee that their report was bad, but would rather say that it could do with more work. The boss is trying to frame the negative feedback positively and politely. This may be in contrast to someone in the Netherlands who might tell the staff member that the report is simply not good enough, and why. Now that we understand how the different values we looked at impact how cultures communicate, let's examine what can happen when people with different approaches come together. Well, A typical perception people who are indirect communicators might have of someone more direct is that they are brash, rude, and even inconsiderate. They can find such people overbearing, unconcerned with people's feelings, and way too confrontational. Rather than risk losing face, they tend to withdraw and communication can become difficult. Direct communicators, however, tend to see indirect communicators as confusing, unclear, guarded, and even devious. A direct communicator tends to interpret the lack of clear information as a sign that something is being hidden. Unable to read non-verbal cues, body language, and other ways of communicating feelings, they fully place their understanding on what is said. This difference in communication style can cause many sorts of challenges when it comes to working with different cultures. Let's consider the following scenario, which can help us see how these differences can come into play in a professional setting. Again, it's based on a real-life anecdote. Wang is from China and has moved to work in a large company in Denmark. When he arrived at the company, he had the opportunity to meet with the directors during a lunchtime meeting. He was looking forward to the meeting as he had a list of questions and areas for discussion that he wanted to put to his seniors. His colleagues were aware that Wang was excited and wanted to demonstrate his abilities. The meeting came to an end without Wang having asked a single question. His colleagues assumed he no longer felt he wanted to share his ideas and said they were sorry he could not ask his questions. A month later, Wang again attends another meeting including directors, but again fails to ask anything. At the end of the meeting, he pulls a trusted colleague to one side and asks, "Why are they not interested in my ideas?" His colleague instantly understands something has gone wrong in terms of communication. Do you have any ideas? Well, Wang comes from a culture which places stress on formality, face, and stability. As a result, he's much more indirect in his communication style. Wang kept quiet in the first and second meeting for a number of reasons. For one, he was in front of superiors. He believes it's up to the superiors to invite him to talk. For him to put himself forward or to start talking without an invitation would be considered rude. His culture places emphasis on being polite, formal, and ensuring you save face. He assumed that if he just interrupted proceedings, that he would damage his face and also potentially the directors too. In the second meeting, he again waited to be invited to speak and interpreted the absence of any formal verbal welcome as a reason not to speak. It's only his exasperation that finally leads to him expressing how he feels and eventually discovering how meetings run in Denmark. So, in this topic, we've seen that communication differences are driven by a number of different values, all of which play an extremely important role. Once we come to understand these values, we're able to understand the way in which they might become manifest in how people think and behave. This can also help us analyse ourselves and help us understand the impact our own communication preferences might have on others. In the next topic, we'll be looking at teamwork and the way in which our values shape the way teams behave. In this topic, we're looking at teamwork and, again, how our values can create different approaches to and expectations around working as a team. As with the previous approaches, let's start with another scale to give us some points of reference. Here, you can see we have two extremes which show how people can differ when it comes to the way they think about their role within a team. At one end, we have an individual approach. In this approach, people see themselves essentially as distinct from their teams. Their identity, their careers, and their goals are driven by their independent ambitions. Their focus is mainly, if not solely, on getting their own jobs done. They are less likely to involve their colleagues in their work and decision-making, more likely to pass complicated work over to someone else once they've done their bit. At the other end of the scale, we have people who take on a more group approach. They see themselves first and foremost as a team member, as part of a whole unit. Unlike the individual approach, these individuals are more likely to see the needs of the team as being more important than their personal needs or careers. Their focus is on building strong relationships within the workplace and working collaboratively to get something done. So, what values might be driving these different approaches? Well, there are of course several, but let's look at three: responsibility, hierarchy, and collectivism. Responsibility relates to where, in cultural terms, people place accountability. In some cultures, considerable emphasis is placed on the belief that individuals have control over what happens within their lives, and that, as a result, they are responsible for any outcomes of their decisions. In such cultures, people are congratulated for accepting blame. In some cases, it may even be considered a noble act. As a result, such cultures also tend to be a lot quicker at openly and publicly blaming people for errors. In cultures with a group focus approach, however, less emphasis is placed on an individual's responsibility. This is due to an understanding that there are greater forces at work in the world over which individuals have no control. As such, success or failure is considered to be due to many factors and not necessarily because of something that the individual might have done. Individuals are far less likely, therefore, to stand up and apologise for something that's gone wrong. And if they do, they're typically expressing general remorse on behalf of their group. Publicly blaming people and accepting blame are generally seen to damage someone's face and reputation. When we look at the world and where different cultures exhibit different attitudes to responsibility and individualism, we notice an interesting trend. In the countries of the world that lean more towards individual responsibility, such as the USA, South Africa, Australia, and the UK, we tend to see the people coming from more multicultural backgrounds. In countries that lean more towards the idea of group responsibility, such as India, China, South Korea, and Saudi Arabia, we find that the people are far more homogenous. Countries such as the USA and Australia were essentially a mix of settled people from other parts of the world. The Chinese and Indians, however, have a much longer shared history. The next value of collectivism is closely related to this idea of where and how countries were shaped. The experience of settlers in countries such as Canada, Argentina, New Zealand heavily influences the modern-day leaning towards individualism we see in these countries. Their histories and identities are written by people who emigrated, leaving family units to start new lives. Without a sense of country or group, individuals had to thrive in order to survive. Collectivist countries, however, tend to exist in places where pretty much the same people, speaking the same language and often practicing the same religion, have lived for a long time. Think of the Arab world, much of Africa and Asia. And to this day, we still see the importance of tribes and other units of identity. Collectivist cultures tend to stress duty when it comes to an individual's responsibilities to the group. As a result, they tend to place a lot of importance on face. Finally, let's look at hierarchy, another value which greatly influences the way in which teams work together. People who value hierarchy believe that everyone has a role to play. This is true both in life and at work. They believe in an order, and that this order needs to be maintained to ensure harmony. At work, there are clear vertical lines of hierarchy, with decision-making being only top-down processes, and people following protocol to ensure status is protected. People expect their bosses to be experts, and to tell them what to do. For people who don't place much priority on hierarchy, they believe in equality between roles, regardless of things like education, class, seniority, or age. They believe individual merit should take more priority. People believe they can and should say what they think, regardless of status or protocol. Organisations tend to have flatter hierarchies, and teams are usually consulted by a manager before decisions are made. A manager is seen as someone that helps, guides, and navigates a team rather than telling them what to do. Countries such as Japan, China, India, and South Korea tend to place the most value on hierarchy. Denmark, the Netherlands, and Australia, on the other hand, place great value on egalitarianism. The UK, Germany, and the US tend to sit in the middle, while countries such as France and Russia are slightly more towards the hierarchical side. Okay, so let's now think about a couple of typical challenges that might come up when people from different cultural perspectives work together in a team. A common difficulty people from a more individual-focused culture have when working in a team dominated by a group-focused culture is that they find their colleagues overbearing. They can feel micromanaged, under constant observation, and suffocated by a lack of personal space. What they interpret as an invasion of privacy, however, is usually more their colleagues trying to make them feel comfortable and ensuring the team maintains harmony. Their colleagues can interpret their reaction in turn as being unfriendly, selfish, and cold. Managers working with cultures that have different value systems can often face many challenges. How we see our leaders and what we expect from them is very closely tied to the values we explored. A hierarchical manager moving into an environment which is more egalitarian is likely to be considered a control freak. Staff may feel that they are no longer trusted to make decisions. Managers, on the other hand, with a more egalitarian approach who join a hierarchical organisation, can lose the respect of team members if they fail to demonstrate the proper status their role demands. I want you now to listen to this case study. As before, we're going to hear about an incident and then break down what happened on a cultural level before thinking about the values that informed the behaviours. David is from the USA. He's moved to Seoul in South Korea to head up his company's expansion into the region. His first task is to hire in local talent, as he strongly believes that the team needs to be Korean in order to win and maintain local business. Rather than go the traditional route of using agencies and placing recruitment ads, David decides to use some of his local contacts in his sector to identify some of the top talent working for other local companies. Having identified 5 excellent targets, he emails them with a very attractive job offer, including a large salary and excellent bonuses. Within days, he receives polite emails from all of them declining his offer. Confused, David manages to find their telephone numbers and calls them, reiterating his offer. All again politely refuse. Now, as with our other stories, this one is again based on real-life events. In the end, David realised what he'd done, but only months later, having better understood Korean culture. Do you have any ideas? Well, remember we mentioned a few times that Koreans tend to be collectivist and group-oriented. As a result of this, the bonds a Korean feels towards their employer is usually akin to that of family. People show incredible loyalty to their companies. Moving to another company, especially if it were only due to an increased salary, would be deemed almost crass in Korean culture. It would be a betrayal to the boss and all their colleagues. In America, however, where David had done his recruiting before, there is no or little sense of loyalty to an employer. In fact, employers expect employees to leave and build this into their plans. So here we see perfectly how different values came together and resulted in a not so positive outcome. So, this brings us to the end of our look at teamwork. We now appreciate the way in which our values can influence what we expect from ourselves as well as others when working in a team. We can now better appreciate different forms of behaviour and understand why people from other cultures may approach teamwork differently. Through applying this understanding, we can start to adapt our approach to get the best out of others, our team, and of course, ourselves. In our last chapter of the course, we're briefly going to be looking at how to handle conflict when it happens in a cross-cultural context. Sometimes at work, despite our best efforts, conflict can arise between people from different cultures. Sometimes the reasons can be cultural misunderstandings, other times not. In those cases where we believe culture may be influencing a situation, we now have some tools to help us analyse and approach it constructively. The simplest way to approach any conflict situation is to take a three-step approach. Respect the people involved, recognise the different viewpoints at play, and then move towards a reconciliation. So, it's respect, recognise, reconcile. We start with respect, as this helps us approach a conflict situation with the right intentions and attitudes. Prior to being able to recognise the dynamics involved in any conflict, we have to respect the other's point of view as well as our own. Respecting both sides helps us find solutions and opens doors to reconciling, whereas going into a conflict situation believing your standpoint to be superior does the opposite. It creates barriers to bringing about resolution. Once we respect, we are more open-minded and better able to recognise the forces at play within a conflict. Recognition comes with time, experience and knowledge. However, most of you will already be bringing a certain level of intuition with you prior to taking this course. And now with your greater appreciation of values, you can really start to recognise certain drivers behind attitudes and behaviours. This process of recognition helps us look at a conflict situation more objectively, as well as to highlight what we may have to do in order to bring about reconciliation. Having recognised what we believe to be behind this conflict, we're now able to move towards reconciliation. Now, this is where you'll have to really start implementing what we've covered in this course. How you reconcile is going to be down to who is involved, the context, the cultures, and of course, your own approach to things like communication. If we think back to some of the previous topics and the values, how could our different approaches to communication help or hinder reconciliation? Consider, for example, direct communication cultures, whereby people tend to say what they think without offence being taken. People from such cultures, when trying to reconcile with people from more indirect cultures, need to make sure they soften their approach, to be more sensitive with their wording or even look at speaking with people in private so as to save face. Being too direct may make a conflict situation worse, as would be the case if someone from an indirect culture continued being too polite for the sake of group harmony or face. Similarly, if you need to reconcile with someone from a more relationship-based culture, you need to stress the relationship, not the task or business at hand. On the flip side, you may be working with someone that doesn't care about the relationship, so the focus of reconciliation needs to be around completing the task or getting business done. So, how we reconcile is going to come down to who you are and who the other party is, as well as what the situation is. Now that you have a better understanding of how and why people approach things in different ways, over time, you'll come to see that you're better able to find reasons behind things and to put measures in place to bring about resolution. We've now come to the end of our course. Congratulations, you covered a lot of information, and together we've really increased our awareness of culture and the impact it has on us. With this awareness in mind, we're now far better placed to make smarter decisions that will help us succeed in our careers, as well as to nurture fruitful relationships. However, remember, now that you've completed the course, your learning doesn't end here, nor does it end once you've been through all the extra resources we've added for you. Your learning will continue for a long time as you proceed to discover more about yourself and others. When working with people from different cultures, we now appreciate the need to be non-judgmental. If we find people doing things differently to us, then we need to ask why. Most people do things for rational reasons, and this course has highlighted some of those. It's important we're also honest with ourselves and ensure we recognise our part in any situation. We need to always remember to be open to trying new things and new ways. In doing things differently, we might find that something works far better for us and opens up even more opportunities than we could have imagined. And finally, we also need to remember not to be so quick at taking offence. If someone really annoys or offends us, and they are from a different background or culture, then we need to be careful about making quick conclusions. We now know that we all carry certain bias that can get in the way. Usually, with some dialogue and the right questions, we work out the true meaning behind things. Remember, honest, open, and good-intentioned communication will help you in most challenging situations.